You know they say gratitude is a debt you can never fully repay. For 3 years, I carried that debt like a second skin. I wore it until it choked me. Every time I looked at the jagged scar running down my thigh, I didn't see a tragedy, I saw a miracle. And I saw the man who gave me that miracle. His name was Dixon. But before I tell you how I found them together or how I realized my entire life since that crash was a scripted play, I need to ask you something. Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and realized you don't know them at all? Like at a cellular level, they are a stranger. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt that gut feeling, but ignored it because you thought you were just being paranoid. I'm reading every single one of them. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because this isn't just a story about an affair. It's a story about a ghost realizing he's been haunted by the living. It started on a Tuesday. Rain was drumming against the roof of our suburban home in a way that usually made me feel safe. Valerie was in the kitchen, humming some song I didn't recognize. She looked beautiful, she always does, but there was this sharpness to her movements lately. 3 years ago, after the accident, she was my rock. And Dixon was there too. The hero who pulled me out of my burning Ford F-15. Oh, just seconds before the gas tank blew. He became a fixture in our lives. My brother. I'd do anything for him. I helped him flip houses, I gave him advice on his investments. I even let him stay in our guest room. I felt lucky. But that Tuesday, I forgot my laptop. I'd headed out for a job site, got halfway down the interstate, and realized I'd left it on the dining table. I pulled a U-turn. When I pulled into the driveway, Dixon's black SUV wasn't there. Nothing seemed out of place. But when I walked through the front door, the house was silent. Too silent. I headed toward the kitchen, but stopped when I heard voices coming from the basement, my home office. He's getting suspicious, Dixon. I can feel it. That was Valerie. Her voice wasn't the sweet melodic hum from earlier. It was flat, calculated. He's a contractor, Val. He's not a detective. Dixon's voice followed, punctuated by a low, arrogant chuckle. The man still thinks I'm a saint. He still thanks me for saving him every time we grab a beer. It's pathetic, really. I froze. My heart didn't just race. It felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I stayed in the shadows, my breath shallow, feeling that old phantom pain in my leg flare up. The insurance money is almost tapped out, Valerie said. I heard the clink of a glass. And the settlement from the hit and run is sitting in the joint account. We need to move faster. I can't keep playing the grieving wife of a cripple. You won't have to much longer, Dixon replied. The crash was supposed to take him out the first time. The fact that I had to actually save him to keep the plan alive was a massive headache. But it worked. He trusts me more than he trusts his own shadow. We own him, Val. Everything he builds, everything he earns. It's ours. He's just the one doing the heavy lifting. The world tilted. The walls of the house I'd spent 10 years paying for felt like they were closing in. The crash was supposed to take him out. The hit and run wasn't an accident. It was a hit. And the man who pulled me from the fire was the one who lit the match. And my wife, she wasn't just watching the fire, she helped pour the gasoline. I didn't storm in. I didn't scream. Something inside me went cold. I turned around, walked out the front door, and got back into my truck. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. I realized that for 3 years, I'd been living in a cage they built for me, But here's the thing about being a contractor: I know how to find the cracks in a foundation. I know how to tear down a structure so carefully that the people inside don't even know it's collapsing until the roof hits their heads. I drove away that morning, but I didn't go to the job site. I drove to a park, pulled out my phone, and started looking at the photos from the night of the accident. There was one photo, a grainy shot of the debris. And that's when I saw it. A small blue plastic shard near the impact site. It didn't belong to my truck. And Dixon used to drive a blue sedan back then, a car he scrapped a week after the accident. Valerie texted me an hour later. "Hey baby, hope the job is going well. Picking up steaks for dinner. Dixon might stop by to help with the deck. Love you." I typed back, "Sounds great, honey. I can't wait to see you both." The war hadn't started yet, not officially. They were still waiting for me to play my part, the grateful husband, the loyal friend, the fool. "You want my life, Dixon?" I whispered to the empty cabin of the truck. "Come and get it. But you're going to find out that some things are too heavy to carry." I headed back to the house, my mind already mapping out the first crack in their foundation. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclamation. And by the time I was done, they'd be wishing they'd left me in that burning truck. The vibration of the engine through the soles of my work boots felt different now. It wasn't just a truck idling, it was a countdown. I pulled back into my driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires like bone, and for a second, I just stared at the front door. Behind that oak wood and polished brass lived a woman who had calculated the price of my soul and found it lacking. I grabbed my lunch pail, straightened my back, ignoring the sharp electric hiss of pain in my hip, and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Walking into that house was like stepping onto a stage where I was the only one who knew the script had been swapped. The smell of searing ribeye hit me immediately, rich, buttery, and deceptive. It was the smell of a happy home. Valerie was there, standing by the stove, her hair pulled back in that loose ponytail I used to think was cute. Now it just looked like the tactical choice of someone who didn't want distractions while they worked. "You're back early, babe," she said, not turning around. Her voice had that practiced lilt, the kind you use when you're talking to a pet or a child. Job site was ahead of schedule. I lied my voice steady, sounding like the Shane she'd spent 3 years manipulating. I walked up behind her, and for the first time, I felt a wave of pure, cold nausea. I didn't see the woman I married at 24. I saw a predator wearing her skin. I reached out and touched her shoulder, feeling the slight tension in her muscle. "Smells incredible. You went all out." "Dixon's coming by, remember?" She finally turned a small, tight smile on her face. "He's been so worried about your leg lately. He thought some extra protein and a few drinks might help you get through the week." I looked into her eyes that had watched me scream in the ICU, and I realized she wasn't looking for pain anymore. She was looking for signs of life, just so she could figure out how much longer she had to wait for me to flicker out. "He's a good man, that Dixon," I said the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Always looking out for us." I spent the next hour in the bathroom washing the grime of the job site off my skin, but no amount of hot water could scrub away the filth of that realization. I looked at myself in the steamed-up mirror. I looked old. The accident had taken my stride, but the betrayal was taking my face. I traced the line of my jaw and made a silent vow I wasn't going to give them the explosion they expected if they ever got caught. I wasn't going to be the angry, broken husband who ends up behind bars while they play the victims. I was going to be the ghost in the machine. Dixon arrived at 6:30 p.m. He didn't knock. He never did. He walked in like he owned the place, tossing his keys on the counter near the door, the same counter I'd built with my own hands during my recovery. "Shane, there he is." Dixon boomed, crossing the kitchen to wrap me in a bear hug. He smelled like expensive cologne and something metallic. Maybe the scent of the shady construction deals he was always bragging about. "How's the leg, brother?" "You looking a bit pale. You pushing it too hard on the site?" "Just tired, Dixon," I said, patting his back, feeling the solidness of the man who had supposedly saved me. "The damp weather makes the metal pins ache. You know how it is." "I told him he needs to rest," Valerie chimed in, sliding a plate of steaks onto the table. She caught Dixon's eye for a split second, a look so fast, so surgical that I would have missed it 24 hours ago. It was a look of shared ownership. We sat down to dinner. It was a master class in psychological torture. I watched Dixon cut his movements, confident, almost predatory. He talked about his new real estate project, complaining about contractors who don't know their head from a hole in the ground. He was mocking me to my face, veiled behind his bravado. "You know Shane," Dixon said, leaning back and swirling the red wine in his glass. "I was thinking about that night. The crash. It's been 3 years. You ever think about finding the guy who hit you? I've still got some friends in the precinct. Maybe we could stir the pot again." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. He was testing me. He wanted to see if I was still hunting, or if I had finally accepted the mystery of my own destruction. "Honestly," I said, taking a slow sip of water, I looked him dead in the eye, letting the silence stretch just a second too long. "I think some things are better left in the dark, whoever did it. They probably have enough guilt to live with for a lifetime. Don't you think?" Dixon's smirk didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Guilt? People like that don't feel guilt, buddy. They just feel lucky they didn't get caught." "Maybe," I replied. "But luck has a way of running out when the bill comes due." Valerie cleared her throat, her fork scraping loudly against her plate. "Can we not talk about the accident? It brings back such horrible memories. I still have nightmares about that phone call from the hospital." I looked at her, my beautiful lying wife, and felt a strange sense of pity. She was so committed to the role. She probably did have nightmares, but not about me dying. She likely dreamt about the moment I opened my eyes instead of closing them for good. The rest of the evening was a blur of calculated normalcy. I played the part. I laughed at Dixon's jokes. I let Valerie lean her head on my shoulder while we sat on the porch. But internally, I was miles away. I was thinking about the joint bank account. I was thinking about the Heroes Fund the community had raised for me, which Dixon had graciously offered to manage through his shell company while I was in a coma. When they finally thought I was asleep, I didn't go to my bedroom. I stayed in the dark of the upstairs hallway, my socks muffling my footsteps. I listened to the low murmur of their voices in the kitchen below. "He's different tonight," I heard Valerie whisper. "He's too quiet." "He's just exhausted," Dixon dismissed. "Stop being jumpy." I checked the truck's GPS logs while he was in the shower. He went to the site, then to the park, probably just moping about his leg. He's a shell of a man, Val. Stop giving him so much credit. "I just want this over with," she said, her voice trembling slightly, not with regret, but with impatience. "I can't keep looking at him without thinking about the life we're supposed to be living in Florida." "Patience," Dixon said. I heard the sound of a kiss, a wet, sickening sound that echoed in the hollow of my chest. A few more months of rehab payments, and we'll have enough to vanish. He'll be left with the house and the debt, and we'll be gone. I backed away into the shadows, retreating to the bedroom we once shared. I lay on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak. They weren't just taking my money. They were waiting for the rehab payments, my disability insurance, to hit a certain number. I was a literal paycheck to them, a human piggy bank. I reached under the nightstand and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook I used for job estimates. I didn't write down their names. I didn't write down the affair. Instead, I started a list of every asset, every account, and every lie I've ever been told. For 3 years, I'd been the survivor. Well, the hero was about to meet the man he created. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I watched Valerie sleep, her face peaceful, untroubled by the monstrosity of her choices. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger is hot. It burns out. I felt resolve. It's cold, and it lasts. I went downstairs and packed my tools. I had a deck to help Dixon with later that week, a deck that looked over a steep ravine behind his property. He wanted my expertise on the structural supports. He wanted to make sure it was safe. As I drove out of the neighborhood, I stopped at the end of the street and looked back at our house. It looked so perfect in the early morning light, the white siding, the manicured lawn. But I knew the rot was in the walls. I knew the foundation was cracked beyond repair. I pulled out my phone and made a call I should have made years ago. Not to the police, not yet. I called an old friend from the union, a guy who knew how to track money through offshore accounts, the kind of guy you call when you need to disappear someone's digital footprint. "Hey, it's Shane," I said into the receiver, my voice reflecting the gray sky above. "I need you to look into a company called Apex Developments, and I need it done quietly. I think someone's been stealing from my house, and I'm not talking about a burglary." I hung up and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could still feel the phantom heat of the fire from the crash, the smell of burning rubber, and my own blood. I used to think Dixon saved me from that fire. Now I realized he just moved me to a slower burning one. But here's the thing about fire: if you sit in it long enough, you either turn to ash or you become something the flames can't touch. I was done being ash. I looked at the blue plastic shard I'd kept in my pocket, the piece of Dixon's car from the night he tried to kill me. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger like a prayer bead. "You want my life, Dixon." I whispered the words, fogging the windshield. "I'm going to give it to you. Every single miserable piece of it." The game was no longer about survival. It was about architecture. I was going to build them a beautiful golden cage, and I was going to watch them walk into it with a smile on their faces. Because the only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose is a man who has already seen his own funeral. The blue plastic shard felt like a hot coal in my palm as I pulled away from the curb. It was a tiny piece of a lie. A jagged fragment of the night my world turned into a fireball. I didn't look back at the house this time. I didn't want to see the peeling paint or the "Home Sweet Home" sign hanging by the door. I just saw the geometry of a betrayal so deep it made the air in my lungs feel like lead. By mid-morning, I wasn't at a construction site. I was sitting in a dim, windowless office on the south side of the city, watching a man named Miller, a forensic accountant who worked for the union, scroll through a sea of digital numbers. "You were right about Apex Developments, Shane," Miller said. He turned the monitor toward me. It's a hollow shell. Dixon has been funneling your disability checks and the local charity funds into this account, but it doesn't stay there. Most of it is being wired to a real estate holding in Sarasota, Florida. The title on that property, it's not just in Dixon's name, it's a joint tenancy. Dixon and Valerie. I stared at her name on the screen. It looked so sterile in that pixelated font. Valerie. The woman who kissed me goodnight and then checked the balance on our shared destruction. Seeing it in black and white was different than hearing it whispered in a basement. It was a death certificate for the man I used to be. There's more, Miller continued. I checked the vehicle registration history for Dixon's old business. The blue sedan you mentioned, it wasn't scrapped because of engine trouble like he told the insurance company. It was reported stolen 2 days after your accident. But the theft report was never filed with the police, only with a private insurer Dixon's brother-in-law happens to run. He buried the car Shane, literally. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. It wasn't just a hit and run. It was a ghost story they'd been writing for 3 years, and I was the only one who didn't know I was the ghost. I thanked Miller, paid him in cash, and walked back out into the Chicago wind. I drove straight to that salvage yard in Hammond. After an hour of digging through records and greasing palms, the yard foreman led me to a corner of the lot where a blue chassis was buried under a stack of old tires. It was mangled, the front end pushed back into the cabin, but on the passenger side door there was a smear of white paint. White paint from my Ford F-150. I stood there in the mud, the smell of oil and old rubber filling my throat. I reached out and touched the dented fender. This was the weapon. Dixon didn't save me. He just missed. He'd planned to be the hero who found my body. But when I survived, he had to pivot. He had to play the savior to stay close enough to finish the job, or at least to bleed me dry while I was too grateful to notice the knife in my back. I headed back home just as the sun began to dip behind the skyline. The Shane who owed Dixon his life was dead. The Shane who loved Valerie was a memory. When I walked through the door, the house was silent again. But this time, I didn't hide. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and waited. Valerie came home 20 minutes later, arms loaded with grocery bags. "Oh, you're home," she said, startled. "You're sitting in the dark, Shane. You scared me." "Just thinking, Val," I said. "Thinking about the deck. Dixon wants to finish the structural supports this weekend. He says we need to make sure the foundation is solid before we put the final boards down." She paused, her hand hovering over a carton of milk. That's good. We want it to last, right?" "Everything has to be built to last," I agreed. "But you know what they say about foundations. If there's a crack at the bottom, it doesn't matter how beautiful the house looks on top. Eventually, the whole thing just slides away." She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine for a sign that I knew. I gave her nothing. The next 3 days were a blur of calculated moves. I didn't confront Dixon when he showed up on Saturday morning with his tool belt and his arrogant grin. I didn't flinch when he clapped me on the shoulder and called me brother. Instead, I took him out to the ravine. I let him stand on the edge of the drop-off, looking down at the jagged rocks 60 feet below. "It's a long way down, isn't it?" I asked, standing just an inch too close to him. Dixon laughed. "Yeah, one slip, and it's over. That's why we're the best Shane. We don't slip." "I've been thinking about the accident Dixon," I said. He stiffened. "Again with that, I thought we moved past it." "I found something," I continued. A piece of the car that hit me. It was blue, a very specific shade of midnight blue, just like that old sedan you used to have. The silence was heavy. Lots of cars are blue, Shane. It's the trauma talking. Maybe, I said. But the weirdest part, I found that car Dixon in a yard in Hammond, with my paint still on the bumper. Dixon turned, then his face pale. He saw the trap closing. "You think you're smart?" Dixon hissed. "I'm the hero. You're just the guy who can't hold his liquor or his life together." "I don't need them to believe me, Dixon," I said. "I just need you to realize that I've already moved the money. Every cent you and Valerie funneled into Florida. It's gone. I closed the accounts this morning." Dixon lunged for me, but my leg didn't buckle this time. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the unfinished deck. "What now, Shane?" he spat. "You going to push me?" "No, Dixon," I said, walking toward the house. "I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do 3 years ago. I'm going to survive." I walked into the kitchen where Valerie was standing, her face white as a sheet. "The steaks were a bit overcooked the other night, Val," I said quietly. "But don't worry. You won't have to cook for me ever again." I walked past her, headed upstairs to pack a single bag. I could hear Dixon screaming my name from the ravine, a desperate fading sound. I didn't look back. I was done breathing underwater. I was finally coming up for air. The zipper of my duffel bag made a sharp final sound that cut through the stifling silence of the master bedroom. It was the sound of a contract being terminated. I didn't take much, just my clothes, my birth certificate, and the small leather notebook filled with the digital fingerprints of a crime 3 years in the making. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of Valerie trying to explain the unexplainable to a man who had just lost his leverage and his mind. I walked down the stairs for the last time, the weight of each step feeling lighter than the one before. Valerie was leaning against the kitchen island, her face a mask of smeared mascara and raw terror. In the backyard, the distant sound of a car door slamming and tires spitting gravel told me Dixon had fled. He was always a coward at heart. Heroes stay, but predators run when the lights come on. "Shane, please," Valerie whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Dixon, he told me you were going to die anyway. He said we were just making sure your life meant something for our future. I loved you, Shane. I really did." I stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, looking at her, really looking at her without the fog of gratitude or the haze of pain. I didn't feel the urge to scream. I didn't feel the need to hear her apologies. "You didn't love me, Val," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a man who had finally found his way out of a dark forest. "You loved the idea of a ghost that kept paying the bills. You loved the convenience of a hero who was actually a monster. But most of all, you loved the lie because it was easier than the truth." I walked out the front door and didn't look back at the white siding or the manicured lawn. Those were just props in a play that had finally closed. 3 weeks later, I was sitting on a small wooden pier in a town 2 states away. The air here didn't smell like Chicago exhaust or the metallic tang of blood. It smelled like salt water and pine needles. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a news alert from my old hometown. "Local hero arrested in multi-year insurance fraud and hit-and-run investigation." The photo showed Dixon handcuffed and looking small being led into a precinct. There was no mention of Valerie yet, but I knew the paper trail I left with the authorities would find her eventually. Justice isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a slow rising tide. I've spent a lot of time lately just sitting by this water, watching the tide come in and out. I used to think my life was defined by the night I almost died. I thought my worth was tied to the man who saved me. But I was wrong. My life didn't start the night of the crash, and it didn't end the day I found out about the betrayal. My life started the moment I decided I was worth more than a lie. And this is where I want to talk to you, because I know I'm not the only one. We all have a Dixon in our lives, someone who makes us feel like we owe them our breath. But I'm telling you now, you don't owe anyone your light just because they handed you a candle in the dark. I've been reading some of your comments, and I want to put it to you directly. Do you think I was too cold, or is justice only real when it's served with a side of cold, hard planning? Would you have confronted them in that kitchen with a camera and a scream, or would you have built the cage quietly like I did? I want to hear your thoughts, because your perspective helps me realize that being a survivor isn't a solo journey. Before you go, if this story touched a nerve, hit that subscribe button. We're building something real here. As for me, I'm still walking with a bit of a limp. But every time I feel that ache, I don't think about Dixon anymore. I don't think about the fire. I think about the fact that I'm still standing. The foundation is finally solid. The air is clear. And for the first time in 3 years, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. Thanks for being part of my journey. I'll see you in the next one.